What if the most powerful military machine in Europe lost the war not because of one mistake, but because of a chain of disastrous decisions? At the beginning of World War II, Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable. Under Adolf Hitler, German forces conquered Poland, France, and much of Europe with astonishing speed using a strategy known as blitzkrieg. Many believed that Germany would soon dominate the entire continent. However, beneath these early victories were serious weaknesses that few people noticed. Germany lacked sufficient oil, raw materials, and industrial capacity to sustain a long conflict. As Hitler expanded the war, he would face enemies with greater resources and stronger economies. What began as a series of spectacular victories would eventually turn into one of the greatest defeats in military history. Germany's early successes created an illusion of invincibility. In 1939, Poland fell within weeks, and by 1940, France, one of Europe's strongest powers, had been defeated. The speed of these victories shocked the world and boosted Hitler's confidence. The German military combined tanks, aircraft, and fast-moving infantry in ways that overwhelmed opponents before they could react. But these victories also encouraged Hitler to become increasingly overconfident. He believed that every enemy would collapse as quickly as France had. This confidence led him to underestimate the determination and capabilities of future opponents. While Germany celebrated its triumphs, Britain remained unconquered, and the war was far from over. One of Hitler's biggest miscalculations was his belief that Britain would surrender after the fall of France. Instead, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill refused to negotiate and promised to continue fighting. Hitler then launched the Battle of Britain, hoping that the German Air Force would destroy the Royal Air Force and pave the way for an invasion. However, British radar technology, skilled pilots, and strong civilian morale prevented Germany from gaining air superiority. The Luftwaffe suffered heavy losses, and Hitler was forced to abandon plans to invade Britain. This marked Germany's first major setback and demonstrated that the war would not end quickly. Despite failing to defeat Britain, Hitler made an even riskier decision in 1941 by launching Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history, involving millions of soldiers and thousands of tanks. Hitler believed that the Soviet Union would collapse within a few months, just as France had. Initially, German forces achieved impressive victories and captured vast territories. However, the Soviet Union was much larger and more resilient than expected. As German troops advanced deeper into enemy territory, supply lines became stretched and resistance grew stronger. Hitler had underestimated both the size and determination of the Soviet people. Another major factor behind Germany's defeat was the harsh Russian winter. German commanders had expected the war against the Soviet Union to end before winter arrived, so their troops were poorly equipped for freezing temperatures. As snow and ice covered the battlefield, tanks malfunctioned, vehicles became stuck, and soldiers suffered terribly from the cold. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were accustomed to such conditions and launched powerful counterattacks. German momentum slowed dramatically, and what had been expected to be a quick victory turned into a long and exhausting struggle. The failure to prepare for winter exposed serious flaws in Hitler's planning. The Battle of Stalingrad became one of the most important turning points of World War II. Hitler considered the city strategically and symbolically important and ordered his forces to capture it at all costs. Fierce urban fighting lasted for months, causing enormous casualties on both sides. Eventually, Soviet forces surrounded the German Sixth Army, cutting off supplies and trapping hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Despite advice from his generals, Hitler refused to allow a retreat. In early 1943, the remaining German forces surrendered. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility and shifted momentum in favor of the Soviet Union. Hitler's refusal to listen to his generals repeatedly damaged Germany's chances of victory. Many experienced commanders advised strategic withdrawals and more flexible tactics when situations became desperate. However, Hitler often insisted that his troops hold positions at all costs. These decisions led to unnecessary losses and trapped entire armies that could have been saved. As the war progressed, Hitler became increasingly involved in military operations, frequently overriding professional advice. His stubbornness transformed difficult situations into catastrophic defeats. Instead of adapting to changing conditions, Germany remained trapped by the decisions of one man. Germany also faced the enormous challenge of fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. While millions of soldiers were engaged against the Soviet Union in the east, German forces were also fighting Britain and its allies in the west, as well as campaigns in North Africa and other regions. Managing such vast military operations placed tremendous pressure on Germany's resources and manpower. Unlike Germany, the Allied powers were able to coordinate their efforts and support each other. Fighting several powerful enemies at once stretched German forces beyond their limits and made victory increasingly unlikely. The entry of the United States into World War II dramatically changed the balance of power. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Hitler declared war on the United States, bringing another industrial giant into the conflict. America possessed enormous economic strength and quickly transformed its industries into factories producing tanks, aircraft, ships, and weapons in huge numbers. German industry simply could not match this level of production. As American resources flowed to Britain and the Soviet Union, the Allies gained a massive advantage. Germany now faced enemies whose combined strength far exceeded its own capabilities. Germany's shortage of oil became one of its greatest weaknesses. Modern warfare depended heavily on fuel for tanks, aircraft, trucks, and naval vessels. Unlike some of its enemies, Germany lacked sufficient domestic oil supplies and relied on imports and captured territories. As the war continued, Allied bombing campaigns and Soviet advances disrupted these supplies. Fuel shortages limited military operations and reduced the effectiveness of Germany's armed forces. Even advanced weapons and skilled soldiers became useless without enough fuel to operate them. This growing shortage severely weakened Germany's ability to continue the war. The Allied strategic bombing campaign caused devastating damage to German cities and industries. British and American bombers targeted factories, railroads, oil facilities, and transportation networks. These attacks disrupted production and made it increasingly difficult for Germany to replace lost equipment. Civilians faced destruction and hardship as cities were reduced to ruins. Although German industries continued producing weapons for much of the war, the constant bombardment weakened the economy and reduced the country's ability to sustain military operations. By 1944, Germany was struggling to cope with the scale of the destruction. By 1944, the Soviet Union had regained the initiative and launched massive offensives that pushed German forces steadily westward. Soviet armies had learned from earlier defeats and now possessed superior numbers of soldiers, tanks, and artillery. German troops fought fiercely, but they could no longer stop the relentless advance. Entire divisions were destroyed, and valuable territory was lost. The Eastern Front became a disaster for Germany, consuming enormous amounts of manpower and resources. What had once been an ambitious invasion had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. On June 6, 1944, the Western Allies launched the D-Day invasion in Normandy, opening a new front in Western Europe. Thousands of ships and aircraft supported the landing of Allied troops on the beaches of France. Despite strong German defenses, the invasion succeeded, and Allied forces gradually pushed deeper into occupied Europe. Germany now faced powerful enemies advancing from both east and west. The pressure became overwhelming, and German commanders struggled to defend multiple fronts with limited resources. The opening of the Western Front accelerated Germany's collapse. As Allied armies closed in, Germany's situation became hopeless. Cities were destroyed, supplies were exhausted, and millions of soldiers had been lost. Nevertheless, Hitler continued to reject the possibility of surrender and ordered hopeless offensives that wasted valuable resources. In April 1945, Soviet troops entered Berlin, and fierce fighting erupted throughout the city. Realizing that defeat was inevitable, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. The collapse of the Nazi regime marked the end of one of history's most destructive dictatorships. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered, bringing the war in Europe to an end. Historians generally agree that Germany lost World War II because of a combination of factors rather than a single mistake. Hitler's overconfidence, the invasion of the Soviet Union, fighting on multiple fronts, shortages of vital resources, the entry of the United States, and the overwhelming industrial power of the Allies all played crucial roles. In the end, Germany's early victories could not compensate for its strategic errors and limited resources. The war serves as a reminder that military power alone is never enough when faced with poor decisions and overwhelming opposition.